Okay, now that I have talked a little bit about the essay assignment, I can finally actually talk about something I want to talk about, which is this great play that I had you all read. I want to say three basic things about the play. The first of those is to explain to you a little bit how this play fits into the scheme of the course, and specifically the second part of the course. You will remember that the second part of the course is called The New World, and it has been about the encounter of Europeans with these peoples in the New World. And specifically, one of the features that we've touched on again and again has been the justifications that various figures have come up with for slavery. And I designed this because eventually what I thought was that this course would start talking about slavery in the United States. So when I chose the Octoroon, it was because I thought that I wanted to do something on slavery in the United States for the last portion of our class. And I was committed to teaching W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, which is a kind of philosophical, poetic, sociological account of the lives of African Americans after the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I also wanted to do something that had, purely kind of literary merit. And so I thought about doing the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, and I hope some of you have actually read that when you were in high school or elsewhere. I also considered doing Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is this incredibly important work of literature. It was published in 1852, and it was so influential. It was apparently only outsold during the 19th century by the Bible, says Wikipedia. But there are features of this book, which were very, very popular, that are still with us today, that are part of our vernacular. Certainly you've heard the expression Uncle Tom, which is usually used as a slight to talk about an African American who is being dishonest to his own community and trying to satisfy whites more than he should be. Unfortunately, Uncle Tom's Cabin is some 500 pages long, and given your other obligations and responsibilities, I knew that would be too much. But, so the other text that I would have taught, had I known about it, was this great this great novel that I just read a few weeks ago called Kindred by Octavia Butler. It was published, I believe, in the late 70s, and it is considered a science fiction novel, but it doesn't really fall into the category of science fiction very well. The premise of the novel is that a black woman writer from the late 1970s, who has recently moved in with her white husband, with no warning at all, experiences a sudden spell of dizziness that transports her through time to the scene of some threat to her white precursor, her great-great-grandfather from 1819. So, as you may glean, I think this is considered science fiction because of the element of time travel, which is never really explained. But that feature of the novel is probably the least interesting. The most interesting feature of the novel is that you have an African American woman whose family, the generations of her family, has survived slavery, survived the Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves, the Reconstruction period, the Jim Crow laws, as well as the Civil Rights movement. And she is now being transported back into the 18th century before all of these tremendous changes occurred. So it's actually, you need to have time travel for this premise to be meaningful, but it's a fascinating idea. The reason why is because the judgments and the experience of the protagonist, namely this woman writer, are fascinating. She is repelled by slavery, but she cannot transcend the effects of the institution of slavery. She tries repeatedly to convince her great great grandfather to free his slaves, but with no success, including for the slave with whom he had fallen in love, and which is to be her great great grandmother. It's a great novel. It really is a great novel. Probably one of the best novels I've read in the past, 5 or 6 years. And Octavia Butler is a female African American science fiction writer, which makes her the literary equivalent of a black swan. I thought that was kind of funny. What that really means is that, of course, science fiction has never really spoken to African Americans, and this is something that Butler rightly complains about. It's just the fact that most of the time science fiction fails to address issues of race. There are some exceptions to this, one of which is what's called Afrofuturism, and if I had more time, we might talk about that, but alas, we don't. So finally, we can actually start talking about the Octoroon. As you may know already, the Octoroon is a play that was written and produced by Dion Boucicault, who was apparently an Irish actor. And this play was put on starting in 1859 and was very, very popular. It was, as you probably have sensed, it's a abolitionist work, and so since the play opened in New York, there you would have an audience which is sympathetic to those kinds of things. But this is still prior to the Civil War. One of the things that I probably again should have warned you about, giving you a kind of trigger warning, is just that the Octoroon uses the N-word freely and unconscientiously, and that may make some people uncomfortable, and with good reasons. I think that is just a sort of hazard that you can't avoid when you're looking at original historical sources like this. But I thought I would mention it. So let's start off by talking about how the Octoroon fits in. It speaks to several of the concerns we have raised throughout the semester, and most importantly, and this goes back to the essay assignment, it gives a sort of first-person insight into the institution of slavery. The first insight that we have in slavery is that it is a historical institution which is passed down from father to son, or from uncle to nephew, in the case of this play, regardless of the political views of the owners. So that's what we see at first with this character of George, who's clearly like one of the most important characters. He seems to treat the slaves very humanely on the planet, and of course, as we know, he's also fallen in love with Zoe. And he's completely unconcerned by the fact that Zoe has slave blood. Now, to my mind, this is sort of peculiar, because how can the owners treat slaves humanely, which I think, is not only the case for George, but for other people, other characters. So, Mrs. Peyton, his aunt, and then perhaps to lesser degrees, what's that character's name? Sunnyside. And Scudder. they all seem to treat these slaves with some degree of um, respect. But, I mean, there's a huge contradiction here, namely that these people possess other human beings, as property. And so that's very peculiar. Um, in fact, one of the things that we find out is that the eldest slave, who is Pete, is the one who treats the slaves with the least amount of respect. So, if you look at, this is in Act 1, just right at the beginning, just a few lines down, Pete says, right after George asks him, "What's the matter, Pete?" Pete says, "It's dem black trash, Master George. Dis air property, once Clarin, dem's gettin' all too numerous round. When I get around, I'll kill some on 'em. Sure." Now, I think that shortly thereafter we discover from Mrs. Peyton that perhaps Pete is just, very, I don't know what you'd say, very animated. But, I mean, at the very least, we can glean a couple of things. First of all, we know that not all slaves are equal, even among slaves. So there are those that have greater status than others. And although I don't think there's many references to it in the text, you may know from other narratives that you've read about slaves that there's always a difference between the slaves of the house and those of the fields. This is one of the features that shows up in the book Kindred that I was recommending before. And it's actually a really, really, of course, interesting feature, because what you find out is that there is a great deal of tension between different slaves based on their status. But let's just go back and make sure that the point is really clear. The point here is that not all slaves are equal. And I suppose that should just be tacit, but it bears repeating. So there is a hierarchy among slaves. One of the ways that we know that there is a hierarchy among slaves reflects back on the character of Zoe herself, and Zoe, again, is the character that the play is written after. She is the Octoroon, and that means, just so you're clear, that she is a character who one of her ancestors was black, and so but 1/8 of her background was black, and she remarks on this in the second act, and I thought that I should read this passage because it's sort of fascinating. So this is again in the second act, where George and Zoe are talking, and this is after George has told Zoe that he loves her, and she is trying to make it very clear to George that he can't marry her, not because she doesn't want to, but because, as I mentioned in part, it would be breaking the law. But the other feature, which is perhaps more important to her, is what she says here, where she says, "That is the ineffable curse of Cain, of the blood that feeds my heart. 1 drop in 8 is black. Bright red as the rest may be, that 1 drop poisons all." My version says flood here, but that can't be right. All the blood. "Those 7 bright drops give me love like yours, hope like yours, ambition like yours, life hung with passions, like dewdrops on the morning flowers. But the 1 black drop gives me despair, For I'm an unclean thing, forbidden by the laws. I'm an Octoroon. To go back to the point that I was trying to make a few minutes ago, I was saying that there's a hierarchy among slaves. Here, what you see in what Zoe is saying is that although she only has this small portion of her background that is black, it already has a kind of cursing effect. And I mean, this is interesting. I mean, she obviously feels really stigmatized by this. But on the other hand, as you probably also know, she's also considered very unique among all of the others. She's not technically a slave, or at least it wasn't thought she was a slave. It was always assumed that Judge Peyton, who is George's uncle, had left her to be free, and so she had a special status in that respect, and that of course reflects, on the other hand, the fact that she's only an Octoroon, or 1/8 African. The other side of that is that there are going to be other slaves that are going to have a greater bloodline. They are going to be quadroons, or maybe they'll be wholly African. So that also reflects this hierarchy, the amount of black blood that one has will situate one within this hierarchy. Zoe, in fact, is way up on the hierarchy. She's one of the people that's supposedly benefiting. She's one of the people that supposedly has transcended her race. But she still obviously is deeply stigmatized by it. And even though in the first act, and then partially through the second act, it appears very much that she is never going to, have to face the things that, for example, Pete and Paul and other slaves have to face, that turns out not to be true. This is a good point to raise a question that is germane to your essay assignment. The question concerns the difference that Rousseau states between natural and what he calls political or moral inequality. His argument is dependent upon the notion that natural inequality does not correspond to political or moral inequality. And I think that's something that we have to be sort of questionable about, just because, well, it may be the case that political or moral inequality is not wholly based on natural inequality or natural differences. That doesn't mean that there aren't times at which those things coincide with one another. To go back to the Octoroon, one of the other features about this play, which I find terribly interesting, is that even though slaves seem to have a secondary status, that doesn't mean that they are not sexual objects. And of course, this point bears on the character of Zoe. Repeatedly, we're told about how beautiful she is, and how all men want to possess her. So her own character, on the one hand, her beauty reflects back on the uncle, who is the owner of the estate Terrebonne. So you'll recall that the uncle has passed, and his property is being passed on to George, but the uncle is also the father of Zoe, and he fathered Zoe with a slave woman who was a quadroon, which means that she was 1/4 black. So her life is literally a testament to the fact that, in this case, this slave woman was a sexual object. That reminds me, because I've been watching it recently, of the Hulu special, The Handmaid's Tale, which I recommend checking out. The Handmaid's Tale has a reference at the beginning of it to how Rachel, who is, I'm not going to be able to remember this right now. Rachel is Jacob's wife, and she's unable to bear children, and so she says to him that he needs to go into her slave woman, Bilhah, or Bilhah, I don't know, I'm mispronouncing that at any rate. But to go back to the Octoroon, the Judge Peyton, that is to say George's uncle, is not able to bear children with his wife, who is the aunt. And at one point, this is, suggested why the uncle had, slept with this slave woman. So Zoe's character reflects back upon the sexual appetites of her father, this uncle, but also upon the character of George, who she is going to, fall in love with. You'll recall that George, who is the nephew, is repeatedly discussed because he had just gotten back from Europe, and supposedly he had met all of these women over and over again. And so there is a tacit celebration of his virility among the people in their community. They're always talking about all of the women that he must have had. To go back to Zoe, as we know, Zoe is the object of several men's eyes, including George, who falls in love with her, but then also the villain of the play, McCloskey. McCloskey says that he must have her, and by this he means that he wants to have her, at least in part, as a sexual object, right? Although also as a slave. In contrast, George appears much more enlightened because he's fallen in love with her. He's able to ignore the fact that she is an Octoroon. But, on the other hand, he has only known her for a few days. Now, he doesn't talk about her as property, but he does want to marry her. And that's a really kind of an interesting feature, because in that respect, the play is confusing the difference between the woman as a wife and the property of her husband, and the woman as part of the estate. So again, this is in the beginning of Act 2. George says to her, in language that I think is supposed to sound very romantic, he says, "Zoe, listen to me. I shall see this estate pass from me without a sigh, for it possesses no charm for me. The wealth I covet is the love of those around me, eyes that are rich in fond looks, lips that breathe endearing words. The only estate I value is the heart of the one true woman, and the slaves I'd have are her thoughts." So, that's a pretty fascinating passage there, right? Because he's slipping back and forth between talking about features of her as being a slave, and yet at the same time as being a wife. So, as enlightened as the character of George seems to be, he himself does not seem to, mind this slipping back and forth between property ownership, which is what the slave owner has, and then property ownership in the form of the wife as the belonging of the husband. There are other features of this play that I would want to discuss if we had more time to do that, but I hope that you will take up some of these issues on Wednesday when you meet to discuss this play. Have a good afternoon.